Thank you. Okay, now we can get it started. Maryam, please.
Great. Thank you, Karla. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maryam, the UC Berkeley founding co-director of Innovate for Health, I4H. I'm also the research lead in health and life sciences at Berkeley Institute for Data Science. On behalf of myself and my partners, Emma Huang, J&J co-director, and Karla Lindquist, UCSF co-director, I welcome you to our very first meeting of the year. We're very excited to update you on the progress of Innovate for Health program, to tell you a little bit about the Data Science Health Innovation Fellowship and introduce you to our current and new cohort throughout the day. Next slide, please. So this is an opportunity for the Innovate for Health team to connect with the wider community at UC Berkeley, UCSF, and Johnson & Johnson, and foster new collaboration. So we're going to tell you a little bit about us, our past, present, and future. And then there are two near-term opportunities that faculty and researchers at UCSF, UC Berkeley, and Johnson & Johnson may want to consider for engaging with I4H directly. And we will be providing some specific information about those opportunities, who to contact and how to get involved. So please consider this the Innovate for Health invitation to be involved in everything we're talking about today. You can always contact us individually or via innovateforhealth@berkeley.edu email address. You can also contact us through our website and we will get back to you. Next slide, please. To start with our past, there's a long history of collaborative effort spanning many departments, both research and training, across UC Berkeley and UCSF, since each has its own diverse strength, ability, and skills. It's not a big surprise in 2016, an effort was launched to bring the UC Berkeley's BID and UCSF BCHSI together to forge an institutional bridge for collaboration and to take advantage of the various expertise in data sciences and computational health. I actually remember the BEDS and BCHSI joint symposium in 2016 and the excitement in the room. Fast forwarding to late 2018, when the initial discussion between BIDS, BCHSI, and J&J took place, that led to 2019. Next slide, please. Led to 2019 big announcement of a premier academic industry partnership to advance the field of data science within healthcare. This partnership was specifically designed to offer experienced data science practitioner from industry a path to take on a translational research project over 2 years, tackling unmet needs in healthcare. Next slide, please. The goals of this program are one, to break down the silos by bringing together the data, the talent, and the domain expert, clinical, methodological, and entrepreneurial from the start. That's very important for us from the start. And two, to develop leaders who will transform healthcare by applying data science to solve unmet needs for patient, provider, institution, and industry. Next slide, please. The Data Science Health Innovation Fellowship is a 2-year fellowship and is structured in 3 phases. The first 6 months is dedicated to project ideation and innovation period. The next 15 months is allocated for research, discovery, and implementation, with the last 3 months reserved for wrapping up the work and for graduation, of course. Next slide, please. Without going too much into details, what is so special about this fellowship is the first 6 months and how it is set up. We have multiple checkpoints with the co-director and the joint steering committee members and the mentors, really aimed about how do we explore unmet needs, how do we think about the solution we might generate to solve them, considering the resources we have, and finally developing the actual proposal. Is the structure somewhat similar to Stanford Biodesign program, but our fellows have 6 months to flesh out their project and to secure 3 mentors, 1 from each organization. And that brings me to my next slide. Thank you. There's really an opportunity here for those of us gathered to shape the project that comes out of this program over the next 6 months. So we really encourage all of the faculty and researchers to respond to our call for mentors and collaborators as soon as possible through our website. This invitation extends to all 3 institutes. Additionally, if interested, please register for our BIDS BCHSI Xchange forum, again, through our website. The immediate goals of this forum are to share the I4H current research project with a wider audience and to increase engagement and improve communication among the 3 host organizations. Meetings will be held virtually on the first Monday of each month at 12:30 to 1:30 Pacific time. Next slide, please. This is just a little bit more details. The only thing here that I would like to draw your attention to is how to contact us, because that's the most important thing. As illustrated at the bottom, on top of our website under the fellowship tab, the drop-down menu includes call for mentor. Please contact us and we answer all the questions you may have. Next slide, please. Again, more details here. Everyone is encouraged to participate in these series. We have already scheduled the next 3 events on December 7, January 4th, and February 1st, where each fellow features one, each session will actually features one of our current fellows. You will hear a teaser of their presentation through their lightning talks later in the day. Please don't forget to register for our upcoming event, again, through our website. Next slide, please. Well, and with that, we want to thank everyone for bringing their experience and expertise to our program and engaging with us in various ways, the Joint Steering Committee members, our collaborators and mentors, our fellows, and our search committee members who help us to bring brilliant fellows into our programs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maryam. And next up, I'd like to introduce David Mongeau, who's the Executive Director of the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, or BIDS, and he will give you an overview of that program now. David. David, you're on mute.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the co-directors and to all of you for joining today for this first research exchange on the occasion of welcoming the second cohort to the Data Science Health Innovation Fellows. My main goal in this brief introduction to the Berkeley Institute for Data Science is to explain the motivations and approaches to data science that BIDS and more broadly UC Berkeley have that align so well with Innovate for Health. The motivations have increased since Innovate for Health launched, and I'll tell you about that. Secondly, and especially for the 6 new fellows, I want to begin making all that BIDS and UC Berkeley can bring to tackling the challenging problems in healthcare through data-driven approaches is clear to you. Learning about and taking the initiative to connect with the colleagues and research resources at BIDS will be very important in the next 8+ months, since we all may not be able to join to work together in person. Next slide. So let's start with the big picture of data science at UC Berkeley and how BIDS fits in. This slide was used at the signing ceremony between Janssen J&J, UCSF, and UC Berkeley when this program launched. And we have today 4 of the fellows who are part of that first cohort when the program launched. As you glance at the information on the slide, I hope you can glean the immense expertise available in the disciplines at the core of data science health innovation, as evidenced under the section called Academic Excellence. And I also hope that you see the emphasis that the university places not only on disciplinary depth, but on transdisciplinary work, which is core to BIDS and can be of great value to Innovate for Health if we think broadly. Next slide. The excellence and emphasis that have moved UC Berkeley to this excellence and emphasis that I mentioned are what moved UC Berkeley to create the Division of Computing, Data Science, and Society, which now brings together the top-ranked computer science and statistics departments together with our School of Information, the data science undergraduate programs, and BIDS as the core interdisciplinary research arm of this division. This is a big move for a university to bring units like this together, and we're on the road to becoming a college. Also note that in everybody's favorite US News and World Rankings, that the data science education program at Berkeley now was ranked #1 this year, which is pretty remarkable because it's such a young program. Next slide. Okay, in creating the center, in completing a strategic plan for the university. As you read this quote from our Associate Provost, Jennifer Chase, I want you to notice the emphasis on biomedicine and health. That is actually something worth noting, especially for the people in Innovate for Health, because Berkeley is not biomedicine and health. We have such a strong presence, right, at UCSF, that people a lot of times don't think of all the health resources and all the health units at Berkeley. So it's very great to see biomedicine and health now called out, not only important to the division, but these are at the highest level research and education foci for UC Berkeley in the coming decade. And then on next slide, there's a focus on, that won't be lost, on transdisciplinary research. Even as we pull together the units into the division, BIDS will reach out across the division, trying to create the novel collaborations that I'm hoping the fellows have in the past and will continue to think about. When you're coming up for a new problem to solve, you're thinking, who should be at the table? And it may not always be the obvious players. It may not just be a computer scientist. Perhaps a social scientist would make a social scientist with deep computer knowledge in an area that you're trying to work on would be a good partner as well. This quote on this slide comes from Saul Perlmutter, who is director of the Berkeley Institute for Data Science and also the 2011 Nobel Prize winner in physics. Saul is on the line, and I'd like him just to have a chance to say hello to the incoming fellows and everybody else.
So let me just throw in my extra word of welcome, and I know that if we were all there in person, we would be having a chance to have a tea and coffee and say hello to each other. And so I'm looking forward to the chance to meet everybody more physically all together in the future. But in the meantime, I'm hoping that we all get to explore as much as we can in this Zoom format that we're all doing these days. So looking forward to all the work you'll be doing and to talking to everybody.
Thank you, Saul. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yes. Okay. So Saul mentioned these unusual opportunities to bridge across disciplines, and I just wanted to harken back to some of what Maryam told us about. It struck me that some of the founding reasons for the Innovate for Health program also had this bridge metaphor, that we were establishing a three-way innovation bridge, all of us bringing different expertise to the table from Johnson & Johnson and from the two universities. And then obviously, and I'm sure Atul will talk about the great data resources available through the UC system. Next slide. So we started there and we've evolved and grown. And just to drive home this point again about within our new division and available to the fellows, there is this emphasis on biomedicine and health. So I think in seeking out relationships at BIDS and Berkeley, because of this new emphasis, there may be even greater interest than we've seen in the past in the problems that you're trying to solve. Next slide, please. So who is BIDS? Just take a quick glance. I'm going to try and make up for some of the first 5 minutes we lost from the program. The main thing for you to maybe see here is that we have several fellowship programs, and I'm hoping you'll take the chance to meet fellows from other programs and other companies we work with and other foundations. Also, if you just take a quick look at the disciplines represented in our faculty council, wanted you to know, again, the interdisciplinary nature. So one of the things I think the co-directors can do as you work with them is help think about all these connections with these various folks that could contribute to your work. And the final thing that's to call attention to is we have a core of key software, research software projects to which you can contribute and that can advance your research. And I hope the 4 fellows from last year will be offering information that validates the strength of the open source software development and how it can contribute to your research. Next slide. Quickly, and you'll have these slides later, I just also wanted to give you an idea of the kinds of problems we're tackling. Right in the middle, a day before election, the presidential and national election, yes, we work in biomedicine and health at BIDS, but we work in a lot of other areas, but there can be learning from that. So this item about increasing voter confidence was actually just featured on PBS News on Friday, the faculty member who behind this work, because this audit approach may be called to bear in the upcoming election. So it's a very dynamic place, and I hope before you put your heads down totally, you're able to engage in some of these areas. Next slide. We also do a lot of work on best practices. Next slide. And that is one of the places that I'd recommend you consider engaging. We also leave finding out that I can't count because there are 3 opportunities on this slide, but my headline says 2. But there is a best practices group. I encourage all of you, the new fellows in particular, some of the existing fellows participate regularly in a best practices work group. There may be things about approaches to data intensive research in biomedicine and healthcare that you're able to take or contribute to this group. Similarly, we have a computational social sciences forum that has wide ranging topics, many in public health. And then finally, I encourage you to register for a program that we do on natural language processing, something that any of you who are going to be using health records, this is something that I'm sure would be of interest to you. And that's another way to connect not only with researchers at BIDS and UCSF, but at many other universities that participate in this conference annually. Welcome, and thank you for letting me give you this overview.
Thank you, David. And now I'd like to introduce Atul, who is, among other things, a director of the Baker Computational Health Sciences Institute, and he is about to give you an overview of that.
So, great. Thanks for having me. And of course, thanks Karla, Maryam, and Emma for really your stellar stewardship, continued stellar stewardship of the program. David, great comments. And thanks to the search committee who really helped us find an incredible class now for the 2nd year. And of course, welcome to the 2nd cohort. Great to have you all here. If you go to the next slide, you can skip this one. All right, so we just in keeping with the Twitter theme of the week, I guess, how it started, how it's going. Baker Institute is it's about 7 years old. I joined UCSF a little bit more than 5 years ago, and we were in offices and cubicles in a building called Mission Hall, and just a month ago we moved into a brand new building. We're barely there. Of course, nobody really goes to work anymore, but we're right across from where the Warriors play basketball. So if you know where that is, the Chase Center, we're literally 1 block south of there. If you go to the next slide, you go to the 2nd floor. There's plenty of space, including a lot of hotel space and space for all of you as fellows. In fact, that went into the design of this space. So if you get off the 2nd floor elevator, this is what it looks like. We're the only kind of occupants of this part of the building here. So everything behind that door there is us. And eventually we'll all be back in person, but right now it's pretty scant who's in there. But that's where we live. Go to the next slide. So the Baker Institute now has 70 faculty members from across the entire University of California, so 4 schools, about 20 departments represented. And really our goal is to continue to bring the best computational informatics AI faculty to UCSF. We've recruited 19 new faculty in the last 5 years, so we're going at a crazy pace here. And really, these are faculty you all are going to be interested in meeting with and potential mentors for any of the projects you see as needed in medicine. And of course, you're going to get a lot of community building, as you'll see in a moment, and training here as well from the Baker Institute. You go to the next slide. So the list of faculty, so the website's at the top there. You'll see all 70 pictures and project descriptions and areas of research for all 70 faculty from this page here. You go to the next slide. And some of the things that you're going to want to participate in the Baker Institute in terms of community building are regular seminar series, lab meetings, which mean that the lab chiefs usually sign up, but they usually don't present. One of their trainees presents. So you hear about what's the latest research going on in any of the 70 labs. And then we also have specific types of area-specific training classes, deep learning, clinical data. Colloquially is running right now, but 20 or so web-based courses to learn how to use clinical data at UCSF. And then special interests like computational imaging, cancer, natural language processing. You go to the next slide. These are some of the more basic training classes. This is not going to be as sophisticated as 4-credit classes, for example, offered at Berkeley, but these are at least ways to get started, to download tools, and really just find a like-minded community of folks to learn with, because it tends to be kind of isolating just being on Zoom all the time. So it helps to have a little kind of core to be with. You go to the next slide. These are mostly clinical, and then these are more basic science and more bioinformatics. Baker Institute partners with the Gladstone Institute, which is a major research institute right next door. All of this in Mission Bay in San Francisco. And you can just see since February, all the classes that have been offered. Again, these are very hands-on pragmatic classes. You all have incredible areas and depth of expertise, but we are all missing something. So if, for example, you never learned the Unix command line, here's a chance to just sneak in there and try to learn stuff that you always wanted to learn. All of these courses are available, and of course, they're online here. You go to the next slide. We also offer tools that we're hoping many of you are going to use. And most notably, so at the bottom, this is the usual kind of IT layer cake. At the bottom is our high performance computing opportunities and options. Winton is what we call that shared computing type of approach, including compute heavy and data heavy projects. Information Commons is where we put all our structured clinical data at UCSF. The clinical notes have been de-identified. Can you imagine 76 million notes in one place, de-identified? We're getting de-identified radiology images in there, genomic profiles, especially the cancer genomes are in there. On top of that, we're trying to build out a knowledge network. How do you interpret the data with some structured formalization of knowledge? And then, of course, all the projects and talent above there. You go to the next slide. Again, this is a quick introduction here. One particular slice of all that I want to point out is UCSF COVID-19 Research Data Mart. It's data.ucsf.edu is a homepage for a lot of these things, including in the /COVID-19 for this. Every element of patient care data for UCSF for COVID-19 is in one place, including the text notes. I think the imaging is getting in there now. 46 users so far with 18 IRB approved studies. So if you want to have a COVID-related data project, this is going to be one place to get to. Now, mind you, we don't have a lot of patients at any one of the UC campuses. It's not like New York City and other places in terms of not being overwhelmed here, but this is an opportunity to use that kind of data to kind of cut your teeth or to take classes with and all the rest. You can go to the next slide. So with all that, UCSF has done a lot of partnerships. And obviously the part and the point of some of what some of you are going to do with this fellowship is to create things, right? We want you to find what is missing and create. And not just create in 2 years, but to build from there, including spinning out companies and all the rest. UCSF has had a rich history with working with companies in medical AI. GE, Intel, NVIDIA, Google are all fair game, right? Of course, we have to do this kind of work safely and respectfully of the data, but this is not off the table here, and creating new companies is certainly on the table as well. You go to the next slide. One great example that I'd like to point out last year, is the work that UCSF did with GE. And so now when a new hospital buys, let's say a hospital buys a new portable X-ray unit that they're going to put in their intensive care unit, if they buy it from GE, it's going to have built in the AI algorithms that look at that chest X-ray and call out two important items. Is there a little bit of a collapsed lung in there that people are missing? And is the breathing tube, right, to help you breathe, is it in the right place? And now if any of those things are wrong, the technician is alerted immediately, way before the radiologist sees this. GE used UCSF data and algorithms co-developed to put this in there. And this is FDA approved now. This is what people will be buying. So this is a best possible solution here, where we use our data and talent and tools and all the people that you're getting to meet with here to create something like this that all hospitals around the world are going to benefit from. You can go to the next slide. And that's just one of 40 or 50 different things that the FDA has approved in AI in medicine. Now, this slide is constantly out of date. comes from the TMF, and there's a link that I've been tweeting out every couple weeks. It's a great site. It's already a year out of date, but you can see on the left there all the different approvals on AI that the FDA has made in the last few years, and you can see the areas of medicine on the right. Everything's fair game. It's not just radiology. It's not just pathology. Everything's up for grabs here. And there's still a lot more to innovate and create here. And this list will continue to grow. You can go to the next slide. All right, now I'm going to take off my UCSF hat. And for the last minute or two, I'm going to put on my UC-wide hat, okay? So just to make that point obvious, UCSF is one of 6 medical schools in the University of California. And I play this role across the entire UC system as the chief data scientist. So just to reintroduce UC to you, we have 10 campuses, 3 national labs, 200,000 employees, and 250,000 students per year. And like everyone else in the United States, we're trying to figure out what to do with our 200,000 employees and 250,000 students in the middle of COVID. We're now up to 20 health professional schools. I keep getting this slide wrong, of which 6 are medical, right? But we have veterinary, pharmacy, dental, nursing, and optometry schools and public health schools. We train half the medical students and residents in California. You can see how much money we make from NIH and seeing patients. And we're not just random centers. I too will quote USD's World Report, but UCSF and UCLA are both in the top 10 in terms of hospital systems. Of course, we only mention those things when we're in the top 10. Otherwise, we don't bother with those metrics. And then also importantly, we have 5 National Cancer Institute comprehensive cancer centers and 5 clinical and translational science awards. So we want to make products that are translated out of the system here. And so what I'll argue is nowhere else in the United States are you going to see 5 academic medical centers working with each other like our 5 do. Okay, this is nowhere else. And that's what we have here. The broad moniker for all this is called UC Health at the top right there. You can go to the next slide here. So what have we done? We've taken all the clinical data, not just from UCSF Health, but from all 6. So San Diego, Irvine, LA, San Francisco, and Davis are huge. They're enormous. Riverside is tiny. They're a brand new medical school. They have a few clinics there, a couple thousand patients. The rest of these have millions of patients. And now we get a copy of all that data monthly, centrally, except for COVID data, which we get daily. So all COVID data comes every night at midnight. You can go to the next slide. And this is what it looks like. I mean, this is killer, okay? If you're into data, I'm just gonna argue nothing beats this, right? Let's get right to the bold bullet there. 5.7, just shy of 6 million patients that we have data on since January of 2012. This is a lot of data. This is every pulse, respiratory rate, every medication they're used. You can see some of the numbers, 250 million encounters, 100 million procedures. My favorite, nearly 600 million medications ordered. The phrase I use is we have everything from Tylenol to CAR T cells, right? From the cheapest possible thing we do to the most expensive thing we can do, right? Program your T cells to fight your own cancer, CAR T cells, right? Yeah, of course we treat patients with that too. So we got data from all of this, right? All that care data in one place. You can go to the next slide here. We've been using this data like crazy, and you got to learn from some of the mentors on our side. We've saved millions of dollars for the entire UC health system, right? Why, doctor, are you using that brand name medicine when there's a generic medicine, right? And how do we just facilitate all of those kinds of transfers and transitions from one cheap to expensive option to the same thing, but cheaper, right? Central management of patients, cohorts, and all the rest here too. But obviously we want to use this for research and development as well. You can go to the next slide. So the way this works is if you get everything working at UCSF, right? And we're going to teach you how to do this, to use a data language called OMOP. It's how we store all our patient care data. It's a vendor neutral worldwide standard or of sorts. If you get things working at UCSF, then when you're ready, we'll help you scale to UC-wide, right? So you get to ask the same question, just with 5 to 6 times the amount of data there. And we'll work through all this process with you, but it's safe, respectful, regulated use of all this clinical data. You can go to the next slide. I think I'm running out of slides here. Yeah, this is my last slide. Boy, what an amazing time it is to do a fellowship like this, right? These are my 3 favorite reports put out by the US Food and Drug Administration just in the last 2 years, right? Look at the one on the back. The FDA, it really cares about machine learning and AI now. They're telling us how they're going to approve things, right? They never used to do that. Real world evidence, right? We have all this raw data. Well, how is the FDA? How do they want to see it being used? And then Digital Health Innovation Action Plan. Digital health means we can now write prescriptions for 8 different apps, okay? There are 8 approved by FDA. It's not a medicine, it's an actual app. It's a clinical trial proven app. Payers are going to start paying for this, right? What an amazing time it is to be a fellow in this program. So this is just the FDA. Of course, it goes beyond that. I'm just thrilled to be part of this. I'm thrilled you are all part of this. Welcome to the program. I'll turn it back over to Karla.
Thank you, Atul. All right, and now I will introduce you to our new cohort of fellows. Akram, Reza, Benjamin, Saeed, Elizabeth, and Mitzra, and they will each be taking a couple of minutes to introduce themselves and to give a brief overview of their backgrounds. Okay, Akram. Next slide, please.
Hello, my name is Akram Bayat, and I was postdoc associate at MIT Media Lab, working on my intersection of machine learning and health. I received my PhD in computer science from University of Massachusetts, Boston. I have a Master of Science in computer science and electrical engineering and Bachelor in electrical engineering. Next slide, please. I have experience working on wearable sensors and machine learning. Yes, and I have worked on the project I have worked as human activity recognition, from conducting the experiments all the way to machine learning techniques for recognizing different types of activities. I also led a team to collect the big data consisting of 200 walking sessions in order to biometric identification and healthcare application. Next slide, please. I also have worked on modeling human behavior characteristics using eye movement data during reading. Actually, this eye movement data behavior has lots of application in biometric and personalized user interface, like dyslexia, people with dyslexia problem. I also conducted a project for combining the information from the text and eye movement data that I received the Best Paper Award in 2017. Next slide, please. I also worked on deep learning in a computer vision application, and the research question was how to enhance the performance of deep visual systems inspired by mechanisms in the human visual system, including using the scene grammar, using the multi-channel frequency in human visual system, and also using the functionality of the scenes, adding to the scene understanding. Next slide, please. During my postdoc, I had a chance to work on computer vision for medical imaging. A very interesting project I did was computational staining of pathology images. And another project I conducted was to develop end-to-end system for an automated pathology image analysis, including computational staining, classification of the tumors, and segmentation of the tumors. Next slide, please. I also have experience working with the EHR data in two aspects. In algorithmic one, I worked on data representations and dealing with the missing data. In application part, we're working on early detection of the disease and real world evidence. I also have experience working with training at MIT I4H program and MIT Venture Mentoring Service for actually creating some business model for the products. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Hi, my name is Reza Erbali. Next slide, please. So I'll first give you a quick overview of my education. I received my bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Sharif University of Technology in Tehran. Then I came to Seattle, University of Washington, Seattle, to pursue my PhD. On the way to my PhD, I also earned a master's degree in mathematics. My PhD thesis was mostly on, PhD work was mostly on optimization algorithms for applications, various applications that arise in problems in statistics and machine learning. To be more specific, I worked on online optimization and online learning problems. These are the type of problems where the data is coming to you online in real time, and you have to make a decision on the spot and update the model. You cannot just wait to see all the data and train your model. During my PhD, I also got a chance to work on an area that I was always interested in, but never had a chance before to work on, and that's computational neuroscience, specifically vision, where I collaborated with researchers in the University of Washington Medical School in a clustering of neurons in this visual area called V4, which is a mid-level visual area in the primate brain. Next slide, please. Well, after graduation, actually a couple of months before I defended my thesis, I joined Cisco as a data engineer. I joined this division of Cisco called Tetration Analytics. Tetration Analytics is this division of Cisco where they focus on gathering data from data centers, both network activity data and workload activity data on a minute-by-minute basis, terabytes of data being streamed on a minute-by-minute basis. And that's why I connected with these people, because most of their applications were real-time and online by nature. And that was my training in PhD. I was part of this team within Tetration called Machine Learning and Security Group, whose job, as the name suggests, was to utilize machine learning and use this data that is being collected and being streamed to detect security issues within data centers of customers. I specifically worked on developing algorithms to detect anomalies and security threats in real time. I was able to actually utilize some of the online algorithms that I was aware of because of my PhD work. And I also worked on a few other problems there. For example, automated application discovery based on the process information, online client server classification of network flows, and a few others. I also got a chance to actually implement these algorithms in production as well, at least the ones that were productionized. And to do that, I used big data frameworks such as Spark, which actually came out of UC Berkeley, ResLab, but it's very used extensively in industry for big data application. And our team, actually, the machine learning and security team, we won in the 2020 Cisco Data Science Award for product innovation, among many other teams inside Cisco. Next slide, please. Also have postgraduate academic experience. I received the postdoctoral research fellowship from Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing for 2 semesters at the UC California, Berkeley. I had to take a couple of months of leave from Cisco to be able to attend these programs. The 2 programs were bridging discrete and continuous optimization. And the second one was the brain and computation program. The main project that came out of those 2 semesters I was at UC Berkeley was this project where I worked on modeling feedback in a part of primate and in general mammalian visual system. This time I worked in an earlier part of the visual system as opposed to my work in PhD. And I utilized information maximization to model this feedback, and also took advantage of some of the recent advances in deep learning and convolutional neural networks and added feedback to that, and took advantage of some of the computational tools available there. And finally, I just want to touch on activities that I do outside work. In case you're interested in any one of those, also I'm willing to chat about those as well. And when I'm not working or wasting time, I either doing some hobby electronics, some very amateur woodworking, figure skating. I'm very, at least once during the time the rinks were open, I was active in that, bird watching and hiking. And that's me outside work. Now I pass it over to the other fellow, Benjamin.
All right, thank you very much, Reza. My name is Ben Lakar, and I'm really excited to be a fellow. I look forward to potentially working with all of you in the program. My undergraduate major was in biochemistry, but I was really fascinated by learning, and therefore I sought research in neuroscience. Next slide, please. While I was an exchange student, I worked in the lab of cell transplantation pioneer Anders Björklund in Lund University in Sweden. I quantified grafted cells in models of Parkinson's disease, and I helped show that there was a dissociation between short-term increased graft survival and the actual behavior in the rats in the long term. Now, in this project, it was really fascinating to learn about how exogenously sourced cells can impact function, but I was really more interested in learning about cell replacement that was naturally occurring. And I found adult neurogenesis to be one of the most striking examples of neural plasticity. And that was the subject of my thesis at Yale, where I worked in Angelique Bourdais' lab. I studied intercellular signaling in the postnatal subventricular zone, and using a combination of calcium imaging and MATLAB image analysis, I was able to show some really striking forms of calcium waves that surrounded the vasculature. And from that observation, we were able to show that blood flow changes that were influenced by cell proliferation were occurring. I continued with my interest in neural plasticity by joining the lab of Fred Gage at the Salk Institute for my postdoc. We were interested in uncovering the molecular changes that occur with behaviorally induced neuronal activation. And the brain region that we were interested in looking at was the dentate gyrus, which is notorious for being pretty sparse in activity. And single cell sequencing was very new at the time, but it seemed like the perfect tool for our question. And we came up with a method that avoided the gene expression artifacts associated with other dissociation methods, and that's how we're able to make progress in that project. Next slide. The single cell expertise I developed in my postdoc led to my positions at Fluidigm, where I first worked as a product application scientist. That's a hybrid position that included leading collaborations, staff training, and some bioinformatics. The work supported development of different single cell methods and a targeted sequencing assay for cystic fibrosis variant detection. I then became a bioinformatics scientist where I wrote pipelines for both single cell and bulk RNA-seq work, and also had a project doing single cell RNA and protein expression in the same cell. Next slide. So when thinking about what to do next, I really drew inspiration from how I spent some of my time outside of the research work or outside of school. As an undergraduate, I served as an America Reads tutor, where I tutored students in South LA. While I was at Yale, I tutored a student from New Haven for over the course of 5 years on a weekly basis. And at the Salk Institute, I was able to merge my neuroscience expertise with some of the things I've been doing with teachers, where I was served as a consultant for some teachers interested in learning about the brain. And in my last job, while I didn't do this as much as I wanted to, I did participate in some events with NeuroVentures here in the city. And therefore, I looked at applying some of my data science skills for good, so to speak. And this past year, I performed an Insight Data Science Fellowship, where I built a model to help understand what kind of school and community features were associated with low-income student success in California public schools. And I found that some features tended to be associated with experimental forms of education. Now in this project, or in this fellowship, I'm seeking a project to merge my life science expertise and my desire to help the underserved and of course the data science skills. And I really value the perspective that you have from your positions in academia and industry. And so I'm looking forward to those future conversations. And so some fun facts about me is I really enjoy hiking and surfing, and also nacho eating. If that's a mutual interest, I'm happy to talk to you. And I also learned Swedish while I was an exchange student in Sweden. Anyway, thanks very much for your time. I will now pass it over to my colleague, Saeed.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Saeed Sayedi. I'm happy to be here as a new fellow. So when I was asked to put together these slides to introduce myself today, I actually kind of started to think like go back to my education and career background and summarize it in one huge map here, as you can see. So I kind of as you can see, I kind of ended up like living and working and studying in different parts of the world. So it was the easiest way to put it together for me. So I did my undergrad in computer engineering, and which was basically followed by a master program in biomedical engineering, sort of introduced me to the world of healthcare and medical imaging applications and the ways engineering can be used to enhance this area. So after I finished my master's, I started basically to join a PhD program in Munich. So within the PhD program in computer science department, I was able to build up more skills and develop some developing some data-driven algorithms and tools to answer some of the questions in medical imaging and mostly in oncology area applications. After my PhDs, however, I ended up staying longer in that city and ended up working for AZ, for AstraZeneca for 2 years, and with a team of oncologists, pathologists, and other engineers, where I was building and deploying analysis models in digital pathology for the images and other types of data. At the same time, I was also involved in a lung cancer screening project in BC Cancer Research Center in Canada, where I kind of work with some of the experts in the domain to build multiple AI applications for cancer classification and detections using radiologic images. At the end of that project, I decided to move to Bay Area, basically started a postdoc fellowship at Stanford 2 years ago. And within that time, I built multiple AI models in healthcare applications, including projects in radiology department, in breast cancer screening, dual energy CT imaging, and multimodality AI. Next slide, please. So the majority of the work I've done so far, or at least like for last few years, was in basically building machine learning, computer vision, and end-to-end deep learning models in medical imaging applications. One of the most recent research projects I led, here you can see here in the bottom right box of the page, I call it I called it ScreenNet. It was a multi-view deep convolutional neural network model that I built to improve the breast cancer screening by triaging the cases before the doctors, or in this case, actually, the radiologists were reading them. So the model was built by training on an image level classifier using a set of more than 80,000 radiology images and corresponding reports to label the cases. However, during my postdoc work, I realized that building the unimodality model that is not the only way that real-world healthcare applications are working. And basically, I got interested in building multimodality AI models for healthcare applications. It took me to study and review the ways of fusing and bringing together images and non-images data. In fact, in a recent work with some of my colleagues at Stanford, we published a review and guidelines paper, which you can see here in the middle box, and also in the Nature Digital Medicine journal already published there, to basically showing how to build multimodality deep learning models in medicine and imaging area. I'm also interested in investigating some of the advanced AI techniques and adapting them in the healthcare domain. In the work you can see here in the left box, basically, I built a GAN model to translate single energy CT images to their equivalent dual energy CT images of the abdomen. And besides all these projects that I've done recently, living in the age of current pandemic situation, I started to feel that advanced AI-enabled mobile health applications and tools could be kind of, like the future, one of the real future needs. And I would like to start investigating more in that area as well. Next slide, please. So this is like what I'm doing, like when I'm not at work, basically. So I was actually I'm used to travel and discover new places, as you can imagine. So, however, I mean, it's basically doesn't happen like for last year or like this year, basically. So I ended up like doing lots of hiking and biking, which I was used to do before actually the pandemic time as well. However, I mean, when I was in Europe, it wasn't always the case. I mean, my bike was ending up being covered in snow most of the morning I was waking up. So with that, I think like I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to work with all of you in close future. So Elizabeth, you can take it over from here.
Thanks, Saeed. Hi, my name's Elizabeth. I'm also very excited to be here. Next slide. Okay, so here's a timeline of my background in education and work experience. I did my bachelor's in physics at Pomona College. I did some of my first experiments, microscopy experiments in a lab at Pomona. I was lucky enough to learn more about biology and specifically areas of biomedical research through a one-year fellowship at NIH in the National Institute of Diabetes and Kidney. I worked on an X-ray crystallography project. I went on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison for my PhD in biophysics, where I designed and conducted experiments using fluorescence microscopy to characterize biomolecular interactions on the millisecond timescale and tens of nanometer length scale. All of my experiments were validated and tested using large Monte Carlo methods. I went on to do a postdoc at UCSF, and then for the past 5 years, I've been working as a data scientist. So next slide. So my postdoc research, my affiliation was UCSF. The lab I was spending most of my time in was at the Advanced Light Source, was involved developing novel methods to image, reconstruct, and co-align two three-dimensional tomographic reconstructions from the same biological specimen. So unlike patient data, which is collected hopefully at 37 Celsius, all of our data sets were collected at cryogenic temperature. So we were able to examine the three-dimensional distribution of fluorescent molecules in the context of cellular ultrastructure by imaging cryogenic specimen in fluorescence and then soft X-ray at the Advanced Light Source. So my contributions to the technology included coming up with the first proof of concept to do the correlation, and then specifically improving and generating novel methods for the fluorescence tomographic reconstruction. Next slide, please. What I enjoyed most, though, about my postdoc at UCSF were the several collaborative projects I was involved in applying the technology to a number of biomedical research areas. I have it listed here. These were all enabled by the technology, including blood cell development, sickle cell, blood structures, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. Out of my postdoc, I was actually, I feel like this is like a U-turn now, but at the time, I thought it kind of made sense that I apply my technical skills and ability to a new domain for a team a really exciting team. And I was really enjoyed in my experience working at a company called Orbital Insight. So when I joined, there were fewer than 10 employees. We were just winning our A round funding from Sequoia Capital. And we went on to grow the team more than 10x and raise over $133 million from Sequoia, Google Ventures. We did a lot of interesting work and we're identified as a most innovative company, next billion-dollar startup, et cetera, aggregating a number of different like geospatial data sets. So we took a lot of satellite imagery, combined it with other data, convolutional neural network based computer vision technologies were core enabling technology. So next slide, please. So as a data scientist and technical lead at Orbital, my time was roughly split between developing one specific software product and building out proof of concept projects. So the software product that I contributed to was the development of a software that predicted daily indices of consumer traffic at retail chains such as Walmart. So we had a daily ingestion of millions of satellite images, or maybe thousands, probably tens of thousands of satellite images, counting of the cars using computer vision, aggregating the car detections in a smart way, and building out an estimate of traffic on a daily basis. So I really enjoyed working with very sophisticated hedge funds to sell in this software product. It was a commercial success, and it taught me a lot about implementing deep learning based models, as well as how to keep them working in production over time, how to deal with working with the software developers, et cetera. In the proof of concept project, Defense Innovation Unit was one of my favorite customers, Tokyo Marine Insurance. And some of the data science techniques we used were predictive modeling, time series forecasting, pattern recognition, anomaly detection, continuous learning model implementation, automation, et cetera. So next slide, please. So here's my contact. You have my contact. I'm on the website. I'm super excited to think of creative ways to improve health and healthcare. I think, again, like some of the other fellows, I really strongly believe AI ML should be used to improve this area, both in terms of health and health outcomes and in terms of efficiency. So I look forward, I'm super excited to be here, and look forward to working with you all.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I hope everyone can hear me. Great. So I thought I would start with my beliefs that brought me to the Innovate for Health program. So before you even get to know me, that's the best way to get to know me. So I believe that cognitive diversity and environments that encourage you to bring your whole self to work create the psychological safety that is critical for innovation. I believe that driving impactful innovation, especially in healthcare, involves thinking not only about the technology, but the context of its use, both from a business and a user needs perspective. That is critical for deployment. When I came across this program over the summer, one that brings academia and industry together in an extremely thoughtful way, I thought, yes. So since then, I've observed, experiencing the interviewing process, observing the doors that are being opened for us to interact with top talent at J&J, UCSF, and Berkeley, listening to the genesis of this program last week from, starting with a simple symposium that brings people together into a room to now being part of the second cohort. All of these signals, in addition to the focus and consideration that's placed on user needs, it bolsters my belief that I can have impact, tangible impact, through this program. Next slide. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mitra Vankipuram. I joined Innovate for Health today as a user-centered product developer with a broad T skill set. I'm going to take a moment to highlight some of the key turning points in my career, in my journey that led me to this point. I started my professional career as a computer science engineer, building virtual reality simulations for a variety of surgical procedures. This is what led me to do my PhD in biomedical informatics, because I found healthcare to be a fascinating place with some really hard problems. So for my PhD, I thought, hey, I want to build a decision support tool for clinical environments because there was a lot of knowledge in place. Very quickly, it became very clear to me that healthcare environments are complex adaptive systems, a system where the whole is far more complex than its parts. I would almost argue that even the most well-funded, digitized, state-of-the-art clinical environment is still a complex adaptive system. So this led me to doing, to my huge surprise, purely qualitative research for my dissertation. That included, I took some time one afternoon to do this math, approximately around 300 hours of observation in trauma, emergency rooms, operating theaters, even EICUs with Banner Good Samaritan Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona. The interesting part is I did not build a decision support tool, but my work was published and was taken on by a master's student who came after me, and he went on to develop the decision support tool. This experience taught me that contributing to product development, it may not always be in the way you first imagined. So I went on to HP, and I joined. There was a promise because I wanted to learn more about product development. And after working in healthcare applications and big data analytics, data visualization, with applications even in spaces from retail to all the way through supply chain, right? I found myself in a user experience research lab, and it is here where I honed my skills in rapid and agile UX research with a focus on delivering insights that were actionable by product developers. So at this point, I was still presenting my research like a research scientist. This is when I slowly started shifting over to the product side. And this experience was where I learned that, doing the research is not enough. This is when I started measuring myself by how my research gets used. And this led me, and this is where I had the opportunity to continue on as a UX researcher with a fancy new title, UX lead in a fascinating Asia market. But I also had an opportunity to take another attempt at trying to make an innovative product development in the AI and machine learning lab. This was a tough choice for me because it had been years since I had done any work in AI and ML and touched a lick of code. But I was drawn to it because one, it was ambitious. It was a team of 4 people asked to build the world's first cognitive load inference engine using physiological sensing for virtual reality hardware. And we had no data when we started. So it seemed like a meaty challenge that I thought I could throw myself at. And, after 2 grueling years of ups and downs, this incredibly scrappy research team, we not only collected data to build our cognitive load models, but we collected our data from Brazil, Taiwan, Taipei, Africa. We made sure we had a data strategy that was that took into consideration bias, because it was very important for us to develop an equitable product. So, and this work is soon going to be shipped soon, called Omnicept SDK. And the thing I learned is, in an environment like this where we tend to take research and put it into product, oftentimes there is no indication that we're going to succeed, but we kept pushing. This was the project that showed me that belief in seemingly impossible outcomes with the acceptance that plans change. That's critical for seeing research go into product that a person will actually pay money to buy. I'm not so into making money, but I usually use money as a sign of the importance of a product in a customer's, life and workflow. Along the way, I have gained a lot of other skills that you might not expect because of my, other passions as well. So a couple of things I want to highlight are, as I worked in a design research team, I'm very familiar with design research techniques, and I have rapid prototyping skills in both hardware and software. One unique one is patenting. I've spent 6 years on patent review committees, with the last 2 years leading the AI/ML patent portfolio development for our lab. So I'm that person in that room who likely say, that's a patent, or that's a patent. And 90% of the time I'll probably be right. But the key takeaway from my background is I am technology and data agnostic at this point. I'm excited about projects where I can have immediate impact on, but I'm also excited about projects where I have absolutely no domain expertise or little domain expertise. One example is, genomic data. So at this point, I'm an open book. I'm just ready to bring, my passion and all of my skill sets to the floor. Next slide. This one I'm going to spend very little time on. It's more to share some links of my work. If you'd like to get to know me better, both as a researcher and as a product developer, for a researcher, I would say read their best paper. For a product developer, I would say check out the product that they've shipped. So here are the links. I'm very proud of my research paper that I put here because it was a paper that was done in 4 months. It took into consideration technology constraints. It was completed in budget, took into consideration user needs. It took the most simplest approach to solve a problem. I loved it for its elegance, and we still got it published. So I would say that's the best way to get to know the researcher. And if you'd like to know the developer, ask me about my experience being a founding member on the Omnicept AI team. I learned a lot about building AI/ML software products, and I'm happy to share my learnings with you. In the meanwhile, here's how to reach me. The email's right there. Thank you all for your time. Back to you, Karla.
Thank you, Mitra, and thank you, fellows. This is a really exciting bunch, and I'm sure a lot of people are excited to work with you now. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce you to or maybe reintroduce you to our fabulous group of fellows who started the program a year ago. Let's see, Steph, Lowry, and Lawrence will first be giving you a brief overview of their projects today. And please join us for future sessions in this series, which will be occurring first Monday of each month to hear more in-depth talks about their projects. And then after they talk briefly, Haley will be giving a full presentation about her project. Okay, so first for the short talks, and I think Steph, you are up next.
Perfect. Yeah, hi everyone. And I'll just echo what's already been said. Yeah, welcome to the new class of fellows. So exciting to have the second class of this fellowship. And yeah, it's been wonderful getting to know you, and we're all excited to work with you more in the months and year to come. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my project just briefly. I'm presenting again the first week of December, as Karla mentioned. So yeah, please come back then, and happy to share more details then. Next slide, please. So I'll start by briefly introducing myself. I'm a statistician by training. I'm obviously one of the current Data Science Health Innovation Research Fellows. But my experience is really at the intersection of data science and public health and public policy. So I've worked at several startups and done a number of consulting projects and sort of extensive consulting work with various national and international public health agencies, including the CDC, the United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS, and the UN Biological Weapons Convention Implementation Support Unit. Next slide, please. So, you've heard this from the presentations that have already been presented, but now is a really exciting time to be thinking about AI and ML in healthcare. So recent survey, nearly 3/4 of healthcare institutions are developing or planning to develop AI applications. And I'll highlight, that's not just talking about use, that's talking about active development and sort of plans to develop. And that's really, really exciting. And there's a lot of promise in that work, but also, anytime you adopt a new technology, especially one that you're developing rapidly, there are a set of risks that come with that. And one of those risks is the risk of sort of creating structures that perpetuate existing racial, gender, and other sort of systemic biases. And Atul couldn't have teed this up for me better in his sort of early slides, talking about the FDA's new and emerging thinking on regulation of these technologies. So it's a really exciting time to be thinking about them. And we're still figuring out the best ways to sort of regulate these technologies and make sure that they're being developed and used in ways that are safe and fair and effective. Next slide, please. And, if you've been sort of following this area in the news, there are a lot of ongoing conversations, both in the academic literature. So just about a year ago now, Dr. Ziad Obermeyer and his collaborators published a study that got a lot of attention, well-deserved attention, on detecting racial bias in a population health algorithm. that was systematically underestimating the health needs of Black patients. There have also been a number of recent sort of articles and publications pushing this conversation forward even more. And regulators are starting to get more and more engaged, asking questions about, how are you using algorithms to make decisions, and what are you doing to ensure that they're safe and fair for diverse communities. Next slide, please. And one of the exciting but also challenging pieces of that is that, as these technologies are emerging, we're still figuring out how to monitor their use and how to audit them in ways that are transparent and sustainable and follow some sort of routine pattern that actually works in the context of how algorithms are being used in healthcare settings. So yeah, my project is developing a step-by-step playbook for these sorts of algorithm audits in healthcare settings. Trying to move towards a sort of framework that makes this transparent and easy for diverse audiences, ranging from clinicians to algorithm developers to students who are learning about these things and can sort of help push the conversation forward. Next slide, please. And so some of my early work that I'll discuss more in the following month, but publication came out a couple months ago with Dr. Atul Butte and Dr. Obermeyer at UC Berkeley, talking about how we can start to think about developing the types of programs and technologies to help oversee how algorithms are used in healthcare settings, and making the assertion that we don't have to start from scratch here. There are a lot of really useful frameworks that exist in other regulatory settings to make sure that medical resources are used safely and effectively. So I'll just highlight one. Hospitals conduct these sort of regular medication use evaluations or drug use evaluations to assess how medications are being used within a given hospital or healthcare setting, and assess the sort of real world evidence for, are they being used in a way that's safe and effective? Is there evidence that those are working for our patients? And so what would it look like if we start to sort of reimagine that work in the context of predictive algorithms? Next slide, please. And so, yeah, so working towards defining a standard process for reviewing these predictive algorithms, really importantly, it sort of starts with just understanding how and when algorithms are used to make decisions. So I think a really important thing to highlight is, it can be tempting to think of like an algorithm as, you develop it and then you sort of throw it over the system and it just exists in an EHR system and it's going to work there in perpetuity. But really, that's not how it works, right? In terms of developing clear documentation and communicating the indication and how something is supposed to be used, and also monitoring how it's actually being used in practice, ranging from that to thinking about monitoring those predictions over time to make sure everything's still working as expected, and assessing predictive performance to look for things like systematic over or underpopulation in currently and historically underserved communities. Next slide, please. So what might this look like? This is just a teaser. Please come back on December 7th, and I'm really excited to talk more about this. Next slide, please. And I'll just stop by passing along my very, very sincere thanks, both to the folks on this slide, but also I know I recognize several names on the list of participants. So thank you all for making time to chat with me, for teaching me about your work. And if we haven't met yet, please feel free to reach out, and excited to have conversations in the future. And with that, I'll pass it on to Lowry for the next presentation.
Great, thanks, Steph. Hi, everyone. So my name is Lowry Kirkby, and my work focuses on using a biomedical knowledge graph to make medical diagnosis predictions. Next slide, please. So I'll start with a bit of background about myself. I received my undergraduate and master's degrees in physics from Oxford University, and there my master's research focused on astrophysics and cosmology. I then transitioned into more biophysics and cellular neuroscience for my PhD, which I did here at UC Berkeley. And then for my postdoctoral work, I did that at UCSF in computational neuroscience and psychiatry. And there I analyzed large-scale time series recordings of from inside the human brain and I developed machine learning methods to identify periods of time when patients entered into depressed or anxious mood states. And so this involvement with patients and with large-scale data science led me quite naturally into joining this Health and Biomedical Data Science Fellowship program. Next slide, please. So within the field of biomedical data science, there's a really big push to use electronic health record data to try and make diagnostic predictions for the sake of improving healthcare outcomes. And it's thought that it can improve outcomes in a number of ways, including increasing the accuracy of diagnoses, driving personalized medicine. It's thought that it could lead to improved public health by using preventative medicine, and can also provide an estimate of therapeutic or pharmaceutical needs. So even though EHRs capture this routine and longitudinal patient data, they're somewhat limited for these types of diagnostic purposes because they're very coarse-grained and they lack a lot of the rich phenotyping that's needed to make really accurate predictions. They also can contain incomplete or inaccurate medical information. Next slide, please. So the overarching goal of my project is to determine if we can integrate EHR data with prior domain knowledge in the form of a biomedical knowledge graph to improve the accuracy of diagnostic predictions. And for this question, I'm particularly focusing on the medical subspace of neurodegenerative disease and dementia. That's partly driven by my own background and interest in neuroscience and the brain, and also because this disease space lends itself quite naturally to these types of questions. Neurodegenerative diseases affect a lot of people worldwide, and accurate diagnosis requires a highly trained specialist. A clinician who I work with describes diagnosis as being an art. My specific aims are sort of split into two main categories. The first is diagnostic subtyping, so to be able to stratify patients who are experiencing dementia symptoms into their diagnostic subtypes. And then second, doing an early dementia prediction, so being able to predict the future risk of someone developing dementia based on their past medical record information. Next slide, please. So what is a knowledge graph? It can be sort of simply a large network of entities and relationships between those entities. So said another way, it's sort of machine readable way of representing information as we understand it as humans in terms of objects in the world and their relationships between them. So you've all heard of Google's knowledge graph. So when you type in a search term into Google and you get an info box that gives you extra information about what you've searched, that's information that's been pulled from its knowledge graph. And within data science, there's a big effort to create what are called knowledge graph embedding algorithms. So these are analogous to word embedding algorithms. And the idea there is to map nodes and their relationships into a low dimensional vector space that can preserve the inherent relationships between the objects in your knowledge graph. Next slide, please. So the knowledge graph that I've been working with is called SPOKE, which stands for Scalable Precision Medicine Knowledge Engine. And this is developed by Sergio Baronzini and the SPOKE team at UCSF, who are part of the Baker Computational Health Sciences Institute. And they have pulled data from a lot of public biomedical databases and been mapping the interactions between all of these different biomedical concepts. And so the idea is that we can use this knowledge engine to extract additional information and help healthcare. Next slide, please. So this is what SPOKE looks like after fitting an embedding algorithm to it. So here the blue data points are the SPOKE nodes, and I fit it what's called a holographic embedding model to it mapping it into a 300-dimensional subspace, vector space. And here I've just plotted the principal components for visualization. So you can see some of the structure that is inherent within the SPOKE knowledge graph. So later on down the line, when I'll present at this research forum, I'll go into more detail about what knowledge graph embedding algorithms are and how we go about fitting a model and validating it. And we'll go into more detail about using the embeddings, how I'm proposing to use the embeddings to then make diagnostic prediction in neurodegenerative disease. Next slide, please. So on that, I'll say thank you to everyone who's involved in the work and pass it on to my colleague, Lawrence. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lawrence Kral. So I'll tell you about my work on the social medicine data storytelling and clinician burnout. Next slide, please. So a little bit about me. My background is in quantitative biology. I've got my PhD in bioinformatics, but during my PhD, I was working in a lot of startups as well. This makes me realize that I really liked building stuff. I was working a lot of hardware stuff, a lot of software stuff, and making things like making an impact in the real world. So after my PhD, I joined a startup, first as a data scientist. It was a microbiome diagnostics startup. But then when we grew to about 400 people, I was the head of product, because I was really interested in data science to make this data understandable and actionable for people. I'd rather talk to people about data than to machines. So this gives me like this, yeah, I have this passion for data visualization and communication. Next slide. So in this fellowship, I'm focusing on burnout and clinician distress. So I don't think I have to tell anyone that clinician burnout is an epidemic. These numbers that I'm showing you here are probably way underestimated right now with COVID going on. Clinician burnout is twice as high as that of non-healthcare workers. And it's especially prevalent in emergency department professionals. So obviously there's a huge problem for clinicians, but it also affects patient care. Like, people receive less, the care is less quality when people are burned out. And if that's not enough, there's also a huge economic burden in burnout, because people leave their jobs, you have to train them, et cetera, et cetera. So even making a small impact on this could make a huge benefit to patients and clinicians. Next slide. So I've been focusing mostly on the emergency department. So in the US, like a lot of patients that come in don't just have medical issues, but also have social issues, especially the patients that come to the emergency department more frequently. And a source of burnout for the emergency department physicians is that they have they have to deal with all these social issues, and they don't have a good sense of the effect of that work, because that's not what they're trained to do, and they don't see the impact of the work, which is like one of the components of burnout. So this is like a quote that I got from one of the emergency department clinicians. If only knew that one of the 100 that I see and make an impact will make a huge difference. Like they have this revolving door feeling. People just keep going back with their social issues. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to put this into numbers, like here you can see, this is from the Parnassus emergency department. You see that, most people come in like only once, right? Like once a year, they break their wrist, they have like a emergency, and they come in. But one of the metrics that the emergency department flags is people that come in 5 times or more as frequent visitors of the emergency departments. And these are usually people that do not just have medical issues, but also have social issues that need to be dealt with. And some of these patients, as you can see from the graph on the right, come in like multiple times a week, and yeah, have a big impact on the emergency department. Next slide. So there's only like, even though it's a minority of the patients are the frequent visitors, they make a huge amount of the encounters that a clinician sees on the day. And some of them, like also, of course, every encounter has multiple clinicians affiliated with it. So it makes a huge impact on the clinic. Next slide. So this is one of the models of burnout, is that it's a imbalance between the demands of the job and the resources that you have. So it's known that if you know about the social resources that a clinic has, burnout will be less. And this makes the meaning of work, makes this like extra power pulling into this dynamic, right? So this not having a good sense of the impact of your work can lead to this emotional exhaustion of your work, feeling that you can't do what you want to do for patients. As I mentioned, like it's known that if you tell people, or if people know about the resources available and know about the impact, their burnout will be reduced. So that's the idea of this project, to use data storytelling to tell clinicians about the impact of their social work that they have. Next slide. So I've been working with the social medicine team at the Zuckerberg San Francisco General. This is a team that's focused on reducing admissions first and foremost, but they're really focusing on all these issues that are non-medical. So substance use, housing, food insecurity, even like legal issues. So they're making a big impact on patients that come in with these kind of issues and not necessarily their medical issues, although that's part of it as well. Next slide. So the idea is to try to reduce burnout by monthly producing these articles that tell, interactive data science stories about the impact of the work that they're having. We'll have, we'll track burnout of the clinicians and see if telling them about the impact of the work that they have, if that reduces burnout. So yeah, the goal is to inform about the social resources that are available, how they're being used, illustrate the impact of the work, hopefully alleviate burnout, and also have these available as resources for fundraising. And yeah, when I'll present in February, I'll show you the interactive version of this, which doesn't work in this presentation. Next slide. So yeah, thanks to all those people and to the fellowship. And with that, I'll give it over to Haley.
Thanks, Lawrence. Thank you all to I4H and the co-directors giving me the opportunity to present today, and thank you all for attending. I've heard about a lot of amazing work today, so I hope I can follow this up right to the end. So today I was just going to tell you a little bit about my own fellowship project of a consolidated framework for generating and validating synthetic structured electronic health record data. So next slide, please. So just a brief outline of the talk. I'll tell you just to give a brief chronology about me, and then tell you about motivation and previous approaches to creating synthetic electronic health record data. And then I'll go, just to make sure we're all on the same page, give a brief overview of generative adversarial networks, or GANs, which are the main sort of methodology that I've been focusing on for creating synthetic EHR data. I'll then tell you about some of the adaptations we've made to these methods to handle multimodal structured data and missing data, which are all common aspects of EHR data, and make sort of these methods much more practical for that use setting. And then go on to tell a little bit about the techniques for validation of realism of synthetic health record data, and also techniques for ensuring privacy preservation. Finally, I'll just very, very briefly touch on a couple of the use cases and case studies on which we've sort of developed synthetic data and developed predictive models. I'll just briefly introduce them here, and I hope sort of at a later one of these exchange sessions, I can give you sort of more details on those case studies. So next slide. So I started out in bioengineering, bioinformatics. I'm a proud UC alum, but UCSD, not UC Berkeley or UCSF. I went to Cornell to get a PhD in computational biology, where I focused mostly on developing machine learning algorithms for analyzing whole genome sequence data for natural selection and for genome-wide association studies. I did a year postdoc in Brazil, where I switched to sort of looking at electronic health record data and doing data science there with some emergency department physicians, and then followed that up with a 2-year fellowship at the VA Boston healthcare system, where I continued developing data science tools, predictive algorithms, data visualization tools, mostly focusing on the emergency department, and continued there as a health science specialist for another 2 years. And then, yeah, last year during the fellowship, had a great year and looking forward to the next year. Next slide. So the main premise that's been shown is sort of to develop of this fellowship is to identify an unmet need. So one of the many unmet needs in healthcare that I came across in my interviews with people at UCSF, Johnson & Johnson, was sort of inaccessible data. And this is something that I also encountered in my previous job at VA Boston. And so this manifests in a variety of ways. One is just barrier to data access, where unreasonable obstacles to data access hold up academic researchers and operational researchers from progressing on clinical decision support and other healthcare and data science related applications. The other is a lack of data sharing. So if particular institutions want to share data, clinical data outside with collaborators, this can be a very difficult process due to regulations and concerns about patient privacy. And finally, de-identified data can be an amazing resource, but there are several applications for which it has limitations. In particular, of particular interest to me, I work a lot with emergency department predictive analytics, where day of the week and seasonal trends are extremely important for looking at many of the aspects of emergency department volume. And so due to the de-identification and HIPAA requirements to remove dates or shift dates, it becomes difficult to look at these patterns. So next slide. So earlier in the year, in February, I conducted just a scoping review of the academic literature to look at synthetic data generators in EHRs. Looked at a bunch of different abstracts and limited it down to 124 studies. This is just up to February of this year. And so that's why if you look at the graph on the right, I have the year of publication on the x-axis, y-axis is the number of publications, and it's segmented by the type of synthetic data that was being generated. If I reran this sort of scoping interview now, I'm sure 2020 would greatly exceed 2019. But what you can see mostly from here is that, especially in imaging, but also in structuring data, there's an increasing interest in creating synthetic data, especially with the rise of generative adversarial networks, which we'll get into in a minute. Next slide, please. In addition to the academic literature, there's a growing interest in the entrepreneurial and industrial space, and these are just a small sampling of some of the companies that are creating synthetic electronic health record data within the EHR space. So next slide. But going back to the academic literature, there's been a couple of approaches that have for creating synthetic electronic health record data that have been developed over the years. First, and so one of the first methods, Emerge, used manually created care maps and population level statistics based on actual EHR data to create a sort of sampling simulation framework where you could sample patient trajectories and create synthetic trajectories that way. This is followed up more recently by a method called Syntheia. The main difference of Syntheia being, although it still relies on these manually curated care maps, all of the transition statistics and prevalence statistics that are used to sample the data within these care maps is developed from publicly available data resources without a dependency on actual EHR data. So it can make it a powerful method when institutional level data is not available. Next slide, please. But more recently, generative adversarial networks, or GANs, have come to prominence for creating synthetic electronic health record data. This has been especially true in images in the popular media. Probably know many have heard of the sort of deep fakes come out of GAN-based and other methods. And this is just one example paper. It looks at lung nodule identification photographs. So on the top are sort of the original photos. They're actually real. On the bottom are the synthetic samples output by the trained GAN. At least to the untrained eye, such as myself, it looks fairly real. So next slide. So there's definitely an unmet need for increased data access. There's been a lot of interest in synthetic data generation. So how does synthetic electronic health record data actually fulfill this need? So first and foremost, because synthetic electronic health record data is synthetic and not actual real records, there's a potential, if it's realistic enough, to be able to distribute this data more widely without the same risks to patient privacy as distributing real data. So this could help facilitate data access for developing novel research and operational methods. Secondly, another area of great interest is to augment existing data sets. Many existing biomedical data sets are either small or highly imbalanced. And so an ability to create synthetic data samples from minority classes and to augment existing training sets for the development of predictive models or other computational analyses could be beneficial. Thirdly, as I was saying before, if we can create synthetic electronic health record data that is realistic enough, we can model seasonal or day of the week patterns within these data sets, which would get over one of the main limitations of the de-identified data sets. And finally, or the last sort of three, being able to distribute synthetic data sets more widely may aid in reproducibility by allowing synthetic data sets to be published alongside manuscripts and software code. It could provide a data resource for courses and hackathons that's more realistic, but is still able to be sort of distributed in a privacy-preserving manner. And just in general, I remember when I first was getting into EHR data, I had no idea exactly what it even looked like. And so just expanding sort of the general knowledge and some of the challenges of dealing with EHR data, synthetic data could help sort of distribute the data and sort of inform general knowledge. Next slide, please. So just make sure we're on the same page. I'll just give a brief overview to generative adversarial networks, which have become very popular approaches for synthetic data generation. So on the left is just a diagram that gives an overview of sort of the high-level GAN model. Essentially what it consists of is two different models, the generator G and the discriminator D, which are usually represented by some type of neural network. The generator is going to take in random noise and output some sample data that's going to be in the same form as your real data X. The discriminator is going to try to the best of its ability to be able to discriminate between real data samples that you provide in the training set and the output from the generator. So in the beginning, all of these, both the generator and discriminator weights are randomly initialized. The generator is going to take in noise and output noise. However, in this sort of iterative training procedure, the discriminator will try its best to be able to determine between the generator and real data, while the generator will try its best to fool the discriminator as this iterative training procedure proceeds. So just more formally, briefly, the sort of algorithm from the main paper is on the right. You take a number of training iterations, and for a number of steps, you'll optimize the discriminator according to the first loss function there. So there you're trying to maximize the probability that the discriminator thinks the real data X is real, and that the data coming out of the generator G of Z is fake. The next step would be an iterative. The next step would be to optimize the generator by trying its best to fool the discriminator, to basically make it feel like the discriminator is the generator is producing real data according to the discriminator output. And so you just iteratively go back and forth until some form of convergence criteria according to these loss functions. Next slide. So this GAN framework was originally developed for a sort of continuous output, mostly for images. Several methods have come along to adapt these continuous GAN-based methods for EHR data. Mostly what that means is that some of these methods have developed a sort of combined framework of a GAN and an autoencoder in order to produce count and binary data, which is more commonly seen within electronic health record data. Although, as I'll get into, the electronic health record data is both continuous, count, binary, ordinal, categorical, all of the above. But with these methods, MedGAN first in 2017, and then a sort of following method in 2020, CoreGAN did, was to train an actual GAN, but then to also train an autoencoder, which essentially decodes the output from the generator from a continuous space to either a count or a binary space, depending on the defined output and activation function. So next slide. So we already have some open source synthetic data generators that have been particularly developed for EHR data. However, there are some remaining challenges. One, as I briefly alluded to before, structured data is itself multimodal. So for both MedGAN and CoreGAN, you're restricted to defining a type of data, either binary or count, and sticking with that type of data. However, as I'll show in a minute, EHR data has many different forms. And so being able to create a consolidated synthetic data generator that deals with all of these different types of structured data simultaneously could potentially produce a more realistic output. Secondly, as far as to my knowledge, there hasn't been much attention paid to looking at missing data patterns within EHR data. As many of you who I'm sure have analyzed EHR data know, missing data is a prominent feature of EHR data. So if we're going to produce realistic synthetic data sets for EHR, it would be great to be able to also realistically model patterns of missing data. And finally, there's been a sort of sporadic attention paid to formal validation for both realism and most especially for privacy preservation of the created synthetic electronic health record data sets. So we really wanted to try to create a consolidated framework that, as much as possible, automates some of the most common validation techniques for validating the realism of the synthetic data set, and most importantly, perhaps the privacy preserving nature of the synthetic data set, which has been fairly more or less neglected, I think, in the academic sphere. So next slide. So structured electronic health record data has many forms. Just to make that more concrete, here I'm going to deal with sort of 5 main forms. You can have a sort of constant variables, which occur a lot in terms of sort of facility or whatever data mart or cohort you define. Binary counts are very, very common too. For example, like a test result, is it normal, abnormal? Building on that, categorical, sort of having more than 2 values is extremely common. The example I have here is for like emergency department disposition, where the patient is sent after the emergency department, home, admit, again, left against medical advice, examples. In addition, there's a variety of different types of numeric data. So counts are really common, whether it be sort of length of stay, number of diagnostic codes, number of medications, and also continuous values. One of the most common types of continuous values in emergency department data is for vital signs, temperature, blood pressure, yeah, stuff like that. So next slide, please. So previous GAN frameworks such as MedGAN have used different types of output activation functions from the autoencoder in order to most realistically model the type of data that they were trying to recapitulate. So for example, that's hyperbolic tangent for sort of binary data and a ReLU for count data. Next slide. However, if we can somehow scale all the data to be within sort of the same range, we can potentially model with a single activation function, for example, a sigmoid function. And this is important because if we want to be able to use a single model to be able to develop all of this, to simulate and synthesize and generate the synthetic data simultaneously, we need to be able to model it all with the same output activation function. Next slide. So there are many more complicated ways to do this. The way that we just took was to use for categorical variable was just use one-hot encoding. So that means that if you have a categorical variable, you just create a separate column and then store a separate column for each unique value, represented as a 1 or a 0. And then we can store associated metadata for the actual values to restore the synthetic data matrix after generation. Next slide. So the way that would work is that after one-hot encoding is done, it's input to the generator outputs a matrix that looks like the one-hot encoded matrix, except you don't have exactly 1s or 0s. You just resolve that with a max function, random sampling if there's equivalent values, and then using the metadata, regenerate the column after synthesis. So next slide. And so for numerical data, we can use another scaling approach just by storing the min and the max of a particular numeric data, a numeric column element as metadata, and then just scaling to ensure that the actual data that's input to the generator training is between 0 and 1, just with a simple scaling function. Next slide. Then because we stored that metadata, we can then take whatever's output from the generator and recapitulate the actual range in the restored data file after synthesis. Next slide. So that's essentially the multimodal data part, but what about missing data? So we could always just use imputation before and just have a user sort of impute missing data beforehand. However, it's not entirely sufficient just because missing data in EHR data sets is often very often non-random. Like one example in the emergency department, for example, is depending on the patient's disposition, they may be lacking particular data elements that almost every other emergency department visit has. So if they leave before triage, the sort of first assessment of the patient after coming into the waiting room, the patient will have a disposition of left before triage and will be missing standard emergency department data elements like a triage score and the first set of vital signs that the patient would get during that first assessment. And secondly, as I said before, I mean, missing data is an important part of synthetic EHR data output. And so if we're going to create predictive algorithms on the basis of synthetic electronic health record data, that synthetic electronic health record data needs to incorporate missing data to be realistic. So next slide. So we're going to use some of the same approaches that we used for handling multimodal data to handle missing data. So for categorical variables, this is a fairly straightforward fix. We just include whatever the missing value is as another valid value and store it as metadata. Next slide. For numerical data, it's a little bit more, just one additional step. So we'll create a separate column that indicates whether the actual data element was missing in the original data matrix, and we'll synthesize that column along with all the other information, and then we'll just replace within the actual numeric column representing the scaled, in this case, temperature. We'll just sample from a random distribution, so hopefully it won't skew the training of the generator too much. Next slide. Okay, so that was multimodal data, missing data, and now validation metrics. What can we use and what can we automate in terms of assessing the realism and privacy-preserving properties of synthetic data? So one of the most common things that many papers use to, as a first step validation for realism is just to look at univariate feature frequency. So you have a data matrix of real data that you want to create, that you want to train a generator to create synthetic data. It has a number of features, and you just look at the feature frequency if it's binary, or an average value if it's continuous, and compare the real feature frequency with the feature frequency in the synthetic data that you generate at the end of the pipeline. And so this is just taken from the CoreGAN paper, where you can see sort of MedGAN has a sort of slightly less tight correlation than CoreGAN in terms of the feature frequency relationship between the real and synthetic data. Next slide. Another really common realism validation feature is this so-called GAN train, GAN test framework. And this is a particular use within when the outcome or the intended use of the synthetic data set is for the training of predictive models. So the GAN train, GAN test is just a way of formulating what is used as the training set and what is used as the testing set, and then training a predictive model using either the real or synthetic data set, and then testing on a real or synthetic data set. So GAN train, as shown in the sort of table here, the training set is the synthetic data. You train a predictive model for a particular outcome with synthetic data, and then you test in a real test set. GAN test is exactly the opposite. You train with real data and then test on a synthetic data set. And they just help you sort of gather sort of different perspectives on the synthetic data and its realism validation. And so you can get sort of plots that look like this from the sort of GAN train, GAN test paper. So on the x-axis is just the number of GAN images, sort of the sample size for the training set. And then the GAN train accuracy, so training on synthetic data, testing on a real data set. And they're just comparing a bunch of different sort of GAN frameworks for creating these synthetic images, which are used to train the model, and comparing that to the model that was trained with real data in blue on the top there. So next slide. So privacy validation is of course also important for a variety of applications of synthetic data, not for all, but for sort of the data access, as we're sort of the data access motivation. It could be extremely important to be able to validate that the privacy of the individuals used to train the generator is not compromised by the release or distribution of the synthetic data set. So one of the most common ways to do this is just to compare the synthetic and real data sets with some distance metric and compare sort of the nearest neighbors. So on the far left, this would just be a sort of nearest, if you took all pairs of a real data set and looked at the nearest neighbor, you could come up with some distribution of distances. And then in the middle, what you would like to see is that if you compare sort of random real and real pairs for nearest neighbors, that if you compare real and synthetic nearest neighbors, that it would more or less model the distribution of distances within the real training set. Just because the underlying idea is that if you're actually training a generator to realistically recapitulate the relationships between all the different features, you should be able to just sample again from the real underlying distribution of those features as in the real data set. What you really don't want to see, what is sort of a main criticism of a lot of these, especially earlier GAN frameworks, is something where the distribution of real to synthetic neighbors is sort of centered around 0, which would mean that the synthetic data generator is essentially copying the real training set, which of course would defeat the purpose of creating synthetic data to preserve privacy, just because it looks very realistic, but you're basically just copying the training set. So not great from a privacy perspective. So next slide. So just to finish up, I'll talk briefly about sort of 3 case studies. And here the real aim was just to demonstrate the generalizability of the synthetic data generation framework that we've built, both from a pre-processing standpoint and actually generating synthetic data to validating that synthetic data. So we had 3 different data sets from 3 different healthcare systems. The first is from the MIMIC data set. It's a publicly available de-identified ICU data set. The second is applied to the UCSF de-identified clinical data warehouse. And the third is from the Department of Veterans Affairs, their COVID data mart. For the first case study, we'll look at patients admitted to the ICU with secondary heart failure, and we'll try and train a predictive model with synthetic data that looks at 30-day all-cause mortality. Features that we'll include within the synthetic data generation process will be demographics, chronic conditions, lab values, ICU stay, and length of stay. For the UCSF case study, the second one, we'll look at emergency department visits to the UCSF Parnassus, and we'll try to predict at triage, sort of at very early on in the emergency department visit, which patients will need a site consult or have a site consult request placed later on in the visit. The idea here is that sometimes this is delayed, and if the site consult request can be placed earlier, you could save on sort of length of stay for the patients and deliver time-sensitive treatment much more quickly. Here we'll use some of the same sort of information, demographics, patient chronic conditions, and electronic health record, along with triage vital signs, mode of arrival to the emergency department, and the chief complaint, the sort of reason that the patient showed up in the emergency department in the first place. Finally, for the COVID data mart, we'll look at patients admitted to the hospital, to a VA hospital, actually veteran patients admitted to a VA hospital, and who subsequently tested positive for COVID-19. For the outcome there, we'll see if we can predict transfer to the ICU, and we'll use a bunch of different features, including demographics, sort of chronic conditions, sort of pre-index, sort of prior to their COVID test and admission, any sort of chronic conditions in the last 2 years, symptoms relevant to COVID, and healthcare utilization that's within the record. So next slide. So it's a lot going on this slide, but it's mostly just to show these are the sort of reports that we really want to be able to generate, so we can sort of have a sort of pipeline from sort of pre-processing data mart, an actual question, to creating and automating a creation of a report that looks sort of holistically at the data, at the synthetic data that's been generated, both from a realism and a privacy-preserving perspectives. So the first quadrant is just a bunch of statistics about the sort of sample size, and then summary statistics about the relevant plots. So on the upper right corner, we look at the sort of univariate feature frequency, and it marks pretty well, almost suspiciously well, which is why it's great to do these privacy-preserving matrix. And then also, we also put here in orange is the sort of scaled raw effect size just from a logistic regression that was performed both on the real data and the synthetic data to see if we can sort of recapitulate variable importance in these factors. So that's not working as well as the univariate feature frequency at this point. I think it has mostly to do with just the fact that some convergence issues with the data as it comes raw out of the generator, just because there's a lot of very sort of small incremental values. We probably need to do some partial transformation back to the original data format in order to more accurately recapitulate sort of effect sizes and importance values for these predictors. Bottom left is the sort of nearest neighbor analyses that I was talking about previously. So these here we compare both sort of real and synthetic, and also to a couple other base cases. So the real versus probabilistic in green is essentially just a probabilistic sampling of each one of the feature values based on the feature frequency in the real data set. The idea there was to create something that's sort of, in between complete random noise and a synthetic data set that takes into account the relationship between the different features. The red is just a sort of random sampling of just basically random noise, which, as you expect, is sort of furthest from the real data. Finally, in the sort of bottom right corner, we have the sort of GAN train versus GAN test framework. And here we can see actually very nicely that a model trained in the real data and tested on a real data set has a AUC that's only slightly higher than training the data, the same model with synthetic data and testing on the same framework. So that's that, I think, is sort of some of the strongest evidence for an application of synthetic data for training predictive models, even when a user does not have access to real data. So next slide. So I'll go a little bit more quickly through these ones. It's basically the same sort of reports, but with these different use case studies. So this is the UCSF site consult requests. You can see in the sort of upper right, we have a sort of strong correlation between the, for the blue, a strong correlation with the frequency. Again, the sort of effect sizes are not as strongly correlated. For nearest neighbors, we have, again, the sort of same sort of pattern of distribution where the distribution of real samples overlaps that of real synthetic. Here, it's the sort of distance between the real and synthetic samples is, the average is slightly less than for the real versus real samples. So there might be some overfitting to the actual real training data set. And then finally, looking at the sort of GAN train, GAN test framework in the bottom right, we don't quite reach the same level of predictive performance as real for training the synthetic data set. But we still have some performance, like an AUC of 0.81 versus 0.88. Next slide. And finally, sorry, it's a little small. This is for the VA data COVID data mart. There's many of the same patterns. Unfortunately, I think we were dumping, let me take full credit for that. I was dumping way too many features into this predictive model, so we didn't get that great of a training for that great of a performance even out of the real model here. So there's definitely some data engineering and or feature engineering in feature selection that needs to happen more closely. However, we do get slightly better than random performance for even training in the synthetic data set. So next slide. So yeah, so just to sum up, we developed a pipeline that deals with multimodal structured data and incorporates missing data generation, which I think is a novel feature I haven't seen, to my knowledge. We've also created a sort of open source software package. The GitHub link is available on the Innovate for Health GitHub website. That basically takes a raw data matrix and goes all the way from the raw data matrix to training a synthetic data model, synthetic data generator, generating synthetic data, and then creating a validation report all in a single pipeline. And we've applied this to 3 EHR data sets from 3 different healthcare institutions. So even though we have all of that, there's only leads to more questions and more features, which makes this project extremely exciting. One of the areas that I'm extremely interested in is further developing the privacy validation metrics. So one area that we're currently working in is in the membership inference paradigm. So membership inference here we're defining as the ability to use synthetic data samples to infer whether a particular individual was used in a training set. This can be extremely problematic, I mean, in general, but especially when a sort of cohort for training a synthetic data generator was based on a highly sensitive condition, for example. In that case, if an attacker is able to use the synthetic data to be able to tell whether a given individual of interest to them was used in the training data set, they would also know that that individual has that sensitive condition. There's also interest in sort of using conditional GANs to expand beyond sort of a matrix-based synthetic data generation. So right now you basically have to have something in a matrix that you feed into these synthetic data generators. But as many who have used EHR data know, often it comes in a sort of relational database format. That is the most common format, and as I think Atul alluded to earlier, there's these common data models such as the OMAT format in this relational database format. So it would be great to be able to use some of the, or expand upon the existing GAN methodology to be able to more realistically capture the way that electronic health record data is stored. There's also interest in sort of combining synthetic structured data generation with synthetic text generation, so creating clinical notes in one format or another. This can take the form of just recapitulating sort of a bag of words or bag of medical concepts, and it could be easily sort of incorporated with structured data and created with, and we've done some work synthesizing these sort of bag of words representations along with structured data using the existing frameworks that I just described. But there's also some work using sort of GPT-2 and other transformer models to create actual text. And I forgot what the last one was, but I think that's probably my signal to wrap it up. Oh, well, let me try to just.
I think we lost Emma. Emma was hosting.
Yeah. Can I just share I have my presentation right up here. Can I just share my slides real quick?
Sure, go ahead.
So yeah, the last is just sort of, this is starting to get more and more interest, is just how synthetic data generators could perpetuate bias within training data sets. And I think there's some interesting sort of overlap with some of the methodology that's been used to mitigate bias within machine learning training for adapting that to actual synthetic data generation. So that's longer term, but something that's definitely of interest. And with that, I just want to acknowledge this work would not have been possible without the work of many people. So thank you to the fellowship and the 3 institutions, along with the fellows, co-directors, steering committee, and all my collaborators at UCSF, the VA, and UC Berkeley. And thank you very much to Johnson & Johnson who funded this work. So thank you very much, and be happy to take any questions. I think there might have been one question in the chat if we have time, but.
Yes. Let's see. I'm just looking for it. Mitra, do you want to ask?
Sure, happy to.
Go for it.
First of all, very exciting work. I have like so many questions, and you're right, good research. My advisor told me generates more questions than it answers. So I'm so excited for this work. So let's start with, I'm very curious about validation of the synthetic data. So for example, is it possible to generate an EHR that looks good on the surface, but it doesn't make sense from a diagnosis standpoint? I'm just curious about, is that possible?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's why we're interested in creating a bunch of different validation metrics to sort of triangulate on the validation, because you could definitely create sort of a data matrix, a synthetic data matrix very easily that models univariate feature frequencies, which is one of the most common things that people do. You can also create a synthetic data matrix that can do sort of dimension-wise prediction very well. But that data set looks much less noisy than actual real EHR data sets and might not be able to give you the prediction performance for a particular diagnostic code. This becomes especially important when you have rare diagnoses or just any feature that occurs very rarely within the data set. Mostly because these generators, especially when you're using sort of large feature spaces, don't do as well for low feature frequencies. So that's why I think like using a variety of validation metrics, using univariate feature frequencies as a first sort of just, let's just make sure that looks okay, to the sort of GAN train framework. Can you create a predictive model that works almost as well as real data for a particular outcome? Then using the GAN test framework to look at the other direction, and that can actually be really informative, because often a pattern I find is that the synthetic data sets are much less noisy, so that when you look at the sort of GAN test, when you're training in a real data and testing in synthetic data, it can often outperform the model that's trained on real data and tested on real data, just because the synthetic data, because it can't because the generator doesn't do as good a job at capturing those low frequency features, turns out to be much less noisy, and so just captures the like very very strong effects between the different features. So yeah, there's definitely a need to further develop more validation metrics and apply many different validation metrics when looking at any synthetic data set. If you have any ideas, I'd be more than happy to hear, because most of these are very empirical at this point too. So you basically just, you test a predictive model, you look at the feature frequency. And so if there's any way to look at things sort of more theoretically, or have some sort of analytic guarantees on realism, that would be interesting.
Thank you, and I'm absolutely happy to help.
Yeah, just to go on that too, on the privacy side, there are some analytic sort of guaranteed methods, sort of incorporating differential privacy techniques with training of these GAN frameworks, usually just by using differential privacy aware stochastic gradient descent, so just incorporating differential privacy within the actual optimization algorithms. So that's actually a very interesting area where sort of the privacy validation could have an analytic framework.
Wonderful. Did anybody have any other questions for Haley at this point?
Yes, maybe I can go ahead and ask one quick question for Haley. So first of all, thank you, Haley. It was a really interesting work. So what I was curious to learn was basically, have you ever solved or basically probably developed like the ways to incorporate like different kind of, modalities like data types? Instead of like only one type of EHR or text data, like for example, like put together like images or like different kind of modalities together to build a like synthetic, imaging framework or like synthetic like data framework in your work?
Yeah, so that's the general idea. Mostly I've just looked at the combination of structured and text, mostly because I think there's been a lot of work in imaging data. from what I remember, so maybe want to validate this, or I can validate this later. For sort of image data, you can incorporate sort of structured data by using sort of conditional GAN framework. Sort of in the sort of, there's been many different sort of conditional GAN frameworks that have been developed for producing synthetic data images. Some of them just condition on the basis of a particular class, but some of the original conditional GANs condition on the basis of a vector. I don't know off the top of my head how well they work, especially when trying to validate both structured and image sort of realism together. But it's definitely technically feasible to create images conditioned on a sort of vector of structured data and combine it that way. For multimodal for structures and text, it's been done and, well, it's been sort of done and sort of speculated on being done in a couple of different ways. The most basic is just to represent the note as some sort of structured format, bag of words, bag of concept unique identifiers from the UMLS, sort of medical concepts, and then just use the same sort of structured methods to create that bag of words concept for notes. The other way that's been sort of, I've played around with a little bit, and other people have done more, although I'm not sure, it might have been published, but I'm not quite sure, is to create a sort of template seed sentence that's seeded by structured data. So for example, the 25-year-old female patient with shortness of breath arrived at the emergency department, ambulatory or something like that. So some template that you can sort of fill in structured data and then feed in that seed sentence to some of these sort of transformer-based models for text generation, like GPT-2 or not GPT-3, and other transformer-based generative models. So that's as far as I know, but I think it's an area of very active interest, both for me and for the wider community, because as we know, many different data sets, not just in healthcare, are multimodal in many different ways in creating synthetic, realistic synthetic electronic health record data sets. You'd have to look at all these different types of data.
Thank you.
So we have a couple more questions in the chat, and we have until 4 o'clock, so we can stick around for a few more after that. I'll read those questions for you, Haley. But just before people jump off, I want to make sure everybody knows that they can contact all of our fellows, and they can find their information on our website, Innovate for Health website, which is just innovateforhealth.berkeley.edu. And keep in mind that all of our new cohort of fellows are looking for mentors and collaborators. And then we also will have more information about this BIDS BCHSI Research Exchange Forum series, so that you can find out when to join future ones. And the next one is December 7th. But okay, I just want to make sure I got that in there. And now back to questions. So there's one from Atul. Atul, I hope you don't mind me calling you, but he wants to know, what do you think it'll take for the FDA to accept findings on trials using synthetic data?
Yeah, that's a big question for sure. I think at the moment, the first step I think would be getting sort of the first step, that sort of regulatory framework step that I'm really concerned with, is getting sort of healthcare institutions comfortable with the idea that synthetic data could be privacy preserving and distributed more widely and safely, and validating that itself is true. So I think that sort of privacy preserving validation from the healthcare institution framework is really important to increasing data access, so more sort of software as a medical device and all of the other algorithms that are FDA approved can actually be developed by the wider community. And also, I think in terms of sort of, creating guidelines and regulatory guidelines for the use of synthetic data and showing proof of its utility, it needs to be more widely distributed, more well understood, and just more widely available, so there can be sort of more use cases and more methods development to ensure that this data, one, is privacy preserving, so it can be distributed, and two, that it's realistic enough that that findings from this data can actually give you meaningful clinical output. I think that's been some of the failing of, or not failing, sorry, but some of the limitations of some of these more widely distributed methods, such as Syntheia. Very valuable method. It just uses publicly available data and sort of care maps, is very flexible, and it's created a lot of really interesting synthetic data. However, some studies have shown that if you try to look at sort of clinical outcomes within data sets that have been synthetically modeled on a sort of population basis, like the state of Massachusetts, and you look at sort of outcomes, they don't model very closely any sort of realistic patterns if they're not directly sampled from the care map, or just not closely enough to be useful. So that's why I think like expanding beyond just these sort of care maps to GAN-based methods or other generator-based methods that develop models on the basis of real data could increase realism to the point where perhaps we could create synthetic data sets that would be useful for looking at outcomes on a population-based level, which then could prove utility for proving findings that eventually, many years down the road, I would assume the FDA would accept. At the moment, though, I think like the sort of from the regulatory side, the first steps would be one, sort of as mentioned, this sort of privacy preservation validation for more wide acceptance and distribution of synthetic data sets. And also just proving utility for hypothesis generation. So if this would just be sort of for internal and external use before applying for an IRB, before going through a lot of paperwork for data use agreements. If synthetic data sets are realistic enough, you can create a sort of predictive model or do a computational analysis to see if there's any worthwhile utility for sort of progressing to the next stage of data access and then validating on actual real data once you've gone through those bureaucratic hurdles. So, yeah. I'm not sure if that's a very satisfying answer, but it's a hard question.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'll just read the next one from Reza, our fellow. Why did you use a null class for missing values instead of using solutions like deep Boltzmann machines that are used for missing features or other ways of dealing with missing features?
Oh, so I'm not familiar with the sort of deep Boltzmann machines for missing features. Can you expand on that, Reza?
Oh yeah, well, I'm not very familiar with it. This is like from 2013. Probably the state of art has changed a lot, but this is one way of like, I mean, dealing with the feature space. It's like a probability space, and when something is missing, you kind of condition on that, so you kind of integrate that missing feature out. But this is from 7 years ago, though. I don't know what people have built on top of that or done it in practice, if it's working or not. I was just wondering if like what were your options when you decided to go with the null class? What are the options you had?
Oh, so the option was just basically to do something that was extremely simple and fast. So there wasn't much, I didn't do much scoping of sort of other options just because it fit within the framework and seemed to work more or less well. But I will definitely look up the solution that you suggested because I think it'd be interesting to explore more sophisticated ways of distributing or sophisticated ways of synthesizing missing data patterns within EHR records. So thank you. If you have any references that you were thinking of, if you want to send them to me, that'd be great.
Oh yeah, I can send you the 2015 paper.
Thank you.
Did anybody have any other questions for any of our fellows? And if not, I guess
I did have some questions, but if we have to really go, we can. I think it's a follow-up to what Reza was talking about and Haley was just talking about, which is just stepping back. And I'm curious about the design decision to I'm curious about, is it more useful to mimic the patterns of missing data to create a more realistic EHR data set today, or vis-a-vis filling in the missing features and creating an ideal data set? I'm just curious about your thoughts, Haley, on that choice point.
Yeah, no, I think it would really depend on the sort of application, the sort of downstream application for the synthetic data set. So at the moment, actually, we're basically creating a synthetic data set particular for a particular application. So those 3 use cases, we had a very particular, we want to develop a predictive algorithm for this outcome with this feature data set. And that's sort of how I've sort of approached synthetic data so far. There's basically been a very sort of concrete, targeted downstream application. So the downstream application actually would benefit from having a more idealized data set where there is no missing data. I mean, for example, if you want to make a sort of educational resource that doesn't have missing data and sort of segment sort of the various challenges with the HR data, and wanted to create something without missing data, then it probably would be beneficial to impute first. However, if we want to create sort of a more generic, like I was talking about, these sort of relational database, structured synthetic data sets for a sort of more generic use cases, sort of to be sort of use case agnostic, then I think it will be beneficial to more accurately recapitulate sort of patterns of missing data. Just because then, if you create a synthetic data that's based on a relational database that incorporates, all of those sort of missing data patterns and all of the different sort of feature different patterns, then essentially you have the same sort of structured framework that you'd have if you had access to the real data, and you can do whatever downstream application that you wanted. So I think it really just depends on what the user has in mind for the actual synthetic data set.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for taking the time to explain, Haley. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for all the questions. Really appreciate it.
This is really great. So we're coming right up to 4 o'clock. I really appreciate having had this opportunity for Innovate for Health team to connect with you all, the wider community at UC Berkeley, UCSF, and J&J. And I think on behalf of myself and my partners, Emma and Karla, at this point, we just want to thank you for attending our first event and staying with us to this point. And we'll hopefully see you on December 7th. Please join us. And we really are keen to engage with you. As a mentor, as a collaborator, please go to our website. If you're interested, contact us and we'll get in touch. Thank you again for coming and participating.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It was terrific.
I was going to, Atul, do you want to say the last word? I know David stepped out for a minute. Do you want to say anything?
How about I say the last word and thank you guys for starting this whole thing and getting these seminars going. This is spectacular. I was hoping it would keep running because people are already still having more discussions in the chat. So, but I think you guys did a great job with this, and really, I'm looking forward to the next one. It's so great to double the class size now of the fellows too. It's just going to be so much more impressive and just amazing.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. We'll keep the next meeting a little bit longer, but I think we've had like about 3 hours. So we'll let people go and have a great afternoon, but we'll join in a great discussion next December 7th. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
See you all then.
Thanks.
Thank you.